All right. Well, I guess the floor is mine. So, welcome everybody. Hopefully you've had a wonderful day at B-Sides Denver. So, good afternoon, good evening for some of you. Especially those who might be on the East Coast. If we got any folks hanging out there, it's actually getting kind of mid-evening now. So, I'm Alyssa Miller, as was already stated. And let me just begin, for those of you that don't know me, by introducing myself. So first and foremost, I'm a hacker and researcher. I have been hacking computers, playing with computers, doing all this fun stuff pretty much my entire life. I mean, I can go back to when I was 4 years old, and my father used to bring a computer home from work over the holidays so he could close accounting books, to at 12 years old when I bought myself a computer. So we're talking like early 90s here, late 80s. That wasn't typical. Most people didn't have computers in their homes yet. My first hacks were in Prodigy, trying to get into games that I wanted to play without having to pay for them. And it's, I went through years as a developer and ultimately became a pen tester and all sorts of other fun stuff. I've been doing security for 15 years. And where I find myself right now is at a company called Sneak, and I work as a security advocate, which means my job is to get out into the community and talk about things that matter in terms of security. And I blog, I do research projects, other things. It's kind of a pretty cool gig, I'm not going to lie. I'm also an author and a blogger. When I say author, I am totally, in the midst of writing a book right now. So I can't tell you the name because we haven't really settled on a title yet. But hey, that's we'll get there eventually. But writing a guide actually to help people find their way into a security career, since we all know that finding jobs in security, especially at an entry level, kind of sucks. And then finally, I am the co-host of a podcast called The Uncommon Journey. I host that with Chloe Mastagi and Philip Wiley, if you recognize those names at all. We interview a lot of great people focused on their uncommon journeys into cybersecurity. Now, the most important part for this talk, though, is I'm also I guess you could say amateur, because I don't get paid to do it, amateur pitmaster. I've been making barbecue for years. And I got started, honestly, because I live in Wisconsin. Yeah, a little doxing here, just a little bit. And if you want actual, real, good barbecue, you don't come to Wisconsin for it. So if you want it and you live here, you got to make it yourself. And, I've been doing this for a long time. I recently bought the smoker that you see here, just brand new this year. And the timing couldn't have been better, by the way. I mean, literally buying this wonderful smoker to replace an older one I had right at the start of, right before COVID hit. Perfect timing. It was great. But if you follow me on Twitter or anywhere else, you've seen probably some tweets from me from time to time with pictures of meat, maybe a Wagyu brisket. And I've found other people in our community who really enjoy barbecuing as well. And it was through that discussion, we were talking about a lot of the strategies that are pretty well adopted in the world of barbecue. Barbecue is this interesting thing. It's kind of a mix of a science and an art form. So where there's lots of things that every pitmaster is going to kind of do their own way, and they're going to go and do things just slightly differently, there's also those certain rules that are they're tried and true, and they pretty much, if you're going to make anything decent in terms of barbecue, you pretty much got to follow them. I mean, they're the basics of how you make good barbecue. And so we got into a discussion one day and started connecting it to security. And I realized, there's a lot of commonality between these rules that we use to make good barbecue and what we need to do when we start talking how we're going to secure our enterprises. It ended up turning into this really great metaphor. And of course, anytime you come up with a good metaphor for how to do security that relates to something really cool like barbecue, I mean, you got to turn that into a talk, right? So that's where we find ourselves today. So let's talk a little bit about the breach trends we're seeing right now. Um, you know, none of us, I don't think, if you've been in security and you're paying attention to what's going on in the security world, I don't think any of us, it's a foreign concept that the cloud environments have been a primary target for breaches. We've seen countless stories of S3 buckets being exposed to the internet, and titles like this one here of the latest in S3 breaches. But we're also seeing increased activity around things like containers. So as we're moving and we're doing more in the cloud, containers are one of those things that are starting to become more and more of a target. And we're starting to see vulnerabilities within containers have some really significant impact. And we'll get to talking some more about that in a few minutes. And then finally, there's my favorite topic, the Internet of Trash, or Internet of Things, if you really want to, be colloquial about it. We're connecting everything to the internet. Everything is becoming a smart device. One of my favorite ones, I just saw, actually, I've got two really great Internet of Trash stories for you really quickly. One is a curling iron. And I struggle to understand why anybody needs to control a curling iron with their telephone. It's mind-numbing to me, and it makes you wonder, why are we connecting all of this stuff to the internet just for the sake of connecting it to the internet? But it gets worse. Like, as bad as I thought that was, did you know that someone had put out a Kickstarter to create a candle that could be lit using your smartphone? Now, what's really interesting about this, besides the obvious fire hazard that is this situation, it could only light the candle. It couldn't put it out. So, like, I start thinking about use cases here. Why do we do these stupid things? Like, okay, I can light the candle. Wouldn't it make more sense if I could at least put the candle out? So I leave my house and I realize, oh my God, I left that candle lit. Click a button on my phone, I put it up. Nah, no, can't do that, but you can light it up. So if you're coming home with your date and you want to create the right mood, I guess, you can fire up a candle. Scary stuff, but this is what we're doing. And of course, all these things, especially in IoT space, they all rely again on cloud. And it's those cloud environments where we're finding some of the most significant breaches. So last year, I was leading an organization centered around our assessment consulting services at a previous employer. And every year we kind of did a look, and we look back on the previous year's performance, what we saw, trends and themes in our assessments, our application pen tests, our network pen tests, and so forth. And what we saw was kind of interesting, and that was maybe not surprising considering everything we just talked about in terms of cloud environments, but configuration management vulnerabilities lead the way. More so than any other type of vulnerability, we were finding things where there wasn't a needed patch, there wasn't some, tremendous O-Day discovered. These were simple things that if you just configure the software right, you'd be safer. But we find 40% of those tests, or 40% of the vulnerabilities I identified through those tests, to be these configuration management issues. So then I look back, I said, well, what has it been over the longer term? And I went back, and you can see 3 years, very, very steady, right around that 40% mark. And in fact, when I drew a linear trend line through it, which is that dotted line you see in the middle, that sucker is flat. It's R equals 0. There is no slant to that. There is no slope in that line at all. Now that tells us a really interesting story, that for the last 3 years, despite all these new technologies, despite any proven technologies, all this change, the thing that we continue to get wrong more than anything else is how we're configuring our environments. That's a scary thought. It also explains why S3 buckets and other things are what are being exposed. But the S3 buckets aren't the only cloud technologies. Remember I mentioned containers before? Well, what do you do when you're going to build a container? Most people don't build containers from scratch. If I want a Docker image, I'm going to go out, I'm going to grab a base image from Docker Hub, and I'm going to build a Docker file that then structures out my entire image in which my microservice or something else is going to run, and it fires it up and it goes. A lot of people will go out to Docker Hub and they're going to look for those official images because there's an implied trustworthiness about something in Docker Hub that's labeled as an official image. Well, just a few months ago, as part of a research project for the State of Open Source Security report that we published at Sneak back in June, I took a look at the top 10 official images in Docker Hub and looked at the known vulnerabilities in those images. And this is the performance, and you can see this is year over year because we did the same thing in 2018. And what we see is it was scary in 2018. In 2019, it didn't get any better. That node base image by itself is pretty terrifying when you see 642 known vulnerabilities in that official base image for Node. And all I did was, I grabbed the latest tag for each of these. And you can see the others are far less. That Node one is kind of the outlier, but even 66, 83, 78, these are all high numbers for known vulnerabilities. So what the moral of the story here is just grabbing an official image doesn't make you more secure. And what about vulnerabilities in open source? So we think about Docker Hub, those are open source containers. What about when we think about the rest of the open source community? We've been talking about open source software for about as long as I've been in security. And the fact of the matter is, the more these ecosystems grow, things like the JavaScript ecosystem with package managers like NPM, or in Java, you've got Maven, we find that there's no way to get away from open source. If you've got a 500,000 line application in your organization, the chances are the majority of that is not code written by your developers, but code that came from the open source market, repositories that are out there on GitHub. And when we look at the vulnerabilities being reported in there, what we see is it's a lot of the same old thing. We see cross-site scripting, we see denial of service and RCE, all these things. These are identified vulnerabilities that exist in the open source community. These are things that developers, especially working in a DevOps, potentially CI/CD type paradigm, are introducing to your software. So the challenge is, I don't have to tell any of you, if you're in security, you know the complex space of what it is that we're trying to secure. So I got to thinking, how does barbecue serve as a metaphor for the things that we can do to make our environments more safe? So I've got 5 rules that every pitmaster must follow that serve as terrific metaphors for how we should also be approaching our cybersecurity infrastructure. So let's get started. Let's get that brisket on and let's talk about some tasty barbecue, and let's also talk about how we're going to shore up our defenses. First and foremost, if I am planning a barbecue, the key word there is planning. Planning and preparation wins the day. What you see in the background here is me taking a brisket and trimming that brisket. I don't just decide one day, hey, I'm going to go make a brisket at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and throw something on a smoker and go. First of all, if I did that, I wouldn't be eating until about midnight at least. And like any meat you buy, that meat coming from the butcher still needs some prep. It needs to be trimmed. It needs some dry rub. It needs to be made ready to go on the smoker. The smoker itself, that's a process that can take anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 hours. So I've got to plan days in advance and know how I'm going to approach this. How am I going to structure my day around managing the fire in my smoker to make sure that everything turns out just perfect? Well, when it comes to security initiatives, we need to do the same. Those of you that attended B-Sides Denver, you're going to recognize some of this topic because I talked about this in more detail last year at B-Sides Denver, and that is, how do you win support for your cybersecurity initiatives? You don't just go out and say, hey, you know what, we need this really, really cool tool, and I'm just going to buy it. And I'm just going to tell management, hey, we need this, and I'm going to go, give me money to go buy it. It doesn't work that way. We understand that. But we have to be playing a long game in security. We have to understand that In order to implement any security initiative, I have to be able to walk into, in many cases, a boardroom or at least an executive committee meeting and justify why it is that I want to do what I want to do. Now, the issue is if I go in there and I dump a lot of FUD, I give them a bunch of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, it doesn't work. But this is what we've done in security for years and years and years. We say things like, well, it's not if you get breached, it's when. And we talk about all the horrible things attackers can do. But the reality is that doesn't motivate people to help us out. That doesn't motivate people to take action. Ultimately, we want those executives, those board members, to take action by giving us money and resources for our initiatives. A number of years ago, North Shore University Hospital did a study, and their study shows us the neuroscience behind this situation. So they looked at problems they were having with infections, and in particular, they traced it back to medical practitioners not washing their hands properly. So they installed video surveillance at all the hand washing stations. And they told everybody about the video surveillance. They hung signs that said, hey, you're on video, be sure to wash your hands. And what they found was they still got less than 10% compliance with their hand washing policies. So then they tried another step. They put up signs. And every time somebody appropriately washed their hands, the sign would give them a little congratulatory message. Well, what they found was when they did that, they got 90% compliance. And the reason why is this. If I want to discourage action, the best thing for me to do is to use threats and fear. Because if you think about it, when somebody fears a threat, their first response is kind of a fight or flight response. And most often as human beings, we respond with flight. We're going to do everything we can to avoid that threat. It's only if we're forced to deal with that threat that we're going to go to fight. And so by using threats and fear, all I'm doing is discouraging action. If I tell them, hey, all these bad things are going to happen unless you do this, well, that's a threat. And instead of attributing that threat to the APTs or whoever it is out there that those threat actors are going to be, their mind attributes it to you, and they're less likely to want to help you out. Now, if I want to encourage action, what I need to do is offer rewards. Just like that it can be simple, just like the positive messages on those signs got people to wash their hands, we can do the same thing when we're trying to win support for our initiatives. But how do I do that? What rewards can I offer? Well, a good reward is to just demonstrate cost savings. How will this security initiative save me costs? Maybe it'll reduce the amount of time that our help desk spends rebuilding PCs or helping people with their PCs after they get infected with malware because I'm going to install some new next-gen endpoint or something. Great. That's a great way to start showing that reward. What's even better is if I can show how that cost savings and that resource savings allows us to tackle a wish list item. Every organization has that wish list that they're not able to get to because either they don't have the money, they don't have the people, or both. And so by saving efficiency, gaining efficiency over here and saving money, I can oftentimes open up those wish list items. The best thing, though, is if I can use a security initiative to open up a new line of business or revenue stream. For instance, I worked with an organization that managed intellectual property centering on patents. And as they were going through a cloud transformation, the one thing they didn't want to move was their system that they used when people made basically like an open records request. When a patent's published, people can request certain records that were filed as part of the patent. And so they still were looking for people to do this very manual process because they didn't trust their cloud environment. So as they were looking to implement CASB in their cloud environment, and they were trying to win support, we just demonstrated how that CASB solution would allow them to set up this subscription service by which people could come in and make those requests for those materials. That was a new revenue stream, and that went over huge. The executives loved it. They had a new line of business, new money coming in. That gave real ROI to that security expenditure, which is always the hardest thing to find. Now, if you're going to do this, you need to also understand, how do you talk to the board, or how do you talk to senior managers? Because it's not the same as going in and giving a presentation to a customer or something like that. First and foremost, what you have to understand is that their time is very short, and they're very used to operating in that way. So unlike how we've always been taught through school, like, hey, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them it, then tell them what you told them, that whole strategy, you don't do that walking into a board meeting. You have 3 minutes to get your pitch out there in front of them. So as you craft your presentation, the things that you want them to hear and see the most need to be the very first things you put in front of their face. Because after 2 to 3 minutes, you may get stopped, shut down. They may tune out. Get it out there in front of them right away, and then support it with your facts and all your detailed figures, and then you can summarize it at the end if you still have time. The second is be prepared to get interrupted, because they are going to interrupt. They know exactly what questions they have in their mind, and they're not going to wait until the end of your presentation to ask them. So again, this also plays into why you need to have your main points up front. Understand who you're talking to and play to that. And then finally, speaking of understanding who you're talking to, anticipate their questions and have answers. You can get away with 1, maybe 2, I don't knows, I'll have to look into that type answers. After that, you just look unprepared. Take a few minutes to understand their motivations, their concerns, and anticipate what it is that they're going to ask. So that's it for rule number 1. Rule number 2, when making a brisket: low and slow, you cannot rush it. Remember I said a brisket can take 8 to 12 hours or sometimes even longer? That's because we're not cooking that sucker at 400 degrees. If we did, we would be eating the toughest slice of cut of meat you could ever imagine. Instead, as you see in the upper left there, we're cooking at 225 degrees, sometimes maybe 250. We want it to take long, because the other thing that we're going to do is we're not cooking that meat to 130 or 140 degrees. We're taking that meat up to 200 degrees or more, which is the point when a brisket actually starts to get tender. So if you did that at a really high temperature, you dry out the brisket, it'd be really tough, and it would just be awful. So we do it at a low temperature. We infuse all that really yummy smoke taste, and what we get is this super tender meat. That's the whole point of smoking a brisket. So when it comes to cybersecurity, it's the same story. We cannot boil the ocean. You cannot secure everything tomorrow. Instead, we need to focus on concepts of continuous improvement. So when people talk about CI/CD, I always ask them, what about the other CI? CI/CD being continuous integration, continuous deployment. Well, what about continuous improvement? What are we doing to constantly get better and better and better? Now, when I talk cybersecurity, I bring up the castle metaphor. And I know some of you are cringing right now. We've heard castle metaphors used for decades in cybersecurity, and really they're usually horrible. But let me flip that usual script on its head. What you see here is a perfect example of a medieval castle. This one is in, I want to say it's in Dover, if I remember correctly. And in the middle of it, you see this large monolithic structure. They called that the keep. And inside the keep is where they put all their most critical assets, the things they wanted to defend the most. Then they built around that keep all these other, you see concentric walls and everything else. They built all these other defenses. You see moats, which now it's a road. It's no longer filled with water. You see, hills and open fields and other things that were all a part of the defensive nature. But it all started with that keep that was built on the top of this hill. And that was the most fortified structure, their point of last defense. We need to think about cybersecurity that way. And to do that, first of all, we need to know what are our critical assets. What do we care about most? And I'm not talking IT assets. I'm talking things like private data. If we're in healthcare, those are healthcare records. If we're in financial services, it's those financial records. But whatever it is, what private data? Do we have private data that we care about? Is that what's critical to our business and keeps our business in motion? It might be critical functions. You think about ICS and or if we think about utilities delivery, they're just keeping those functions running, being able to deliver those critical services, that is a crucial asset for their business. That's what matters to them. Financial assets, of course, are important to every organization. How do we protect our money? We're in business to make money. If we don't have money to pay the bills and to pay our people, we're out of business. What about those people? Aren't they assets to us too? And aren't they assets that we have to defend with our IT systems? Of course they are. So we need to understand what those assets are and make sure that they're a part of our keep. And then finally, all of our secrets, whether they're trade secrets, whether they're other things that we need to protect from the marketplace, things that don't fit into any of these other categories, those other secrets. How do we defend those? That's what we need to be focused on. This is how we need to think of those assets. And then we can start to talk about how do we go about defending them. Now, when we defend them, and I think about that castle again, we have basically three types of defenses in a castle. First of all, there's those preventative defenses. They're those things that are very just, they're like the walls. They don't really do anything. They're not active. They just stand there and they do their thing. Then we also have the archers and the more active defenses that are preventative. They're the ones that are actively going to try to stop people coming in. But then we also have things like mitigation defenses. And mitigation defenses are meant just to simply slow down that incoming attack. So you think about those long yards between the walls. So even though somebody breached a wall, they now have to cross this yard, and our preventative defenses have time to respond to them as they're crossing that long yard. Or you think about that moat. It takes time to get across the moat if the drawbridge is up. Things like that. And then finally, we have our detection mechanisms, which are those guards that are watching for people breaching the walls and other defenses. We need to do the same thing as we build cybersecurity. We build those concentrically out from our critical assets. And then it's just that continuous improvement. It's identifying those assets, translating them to where they live in the IT space, establish small perimeters around them, defend those perimeters. We assess those defenses, and then we just repeat the process. That's how we get to continuous improvement. Pitmaster rule number 3. Good smoke is essential. Dirty smoke will ruin you. What you see here is an image of what we in the barbecue business call clean smoke. Clean smoke is almost disappearing. It's very blue in color. Sometimes you can't see it at all. But it's not that big, billowy, plumy white stuff. When you have that big, billowy, plumy white stuff, that means you're burning creosote. And creosote imparts an awful taste in your meat. You don't want creosote getting created in your burning process. So as I'm burning wood, I'm looking for that wood to burn very efficiently, such that it creates only the small amount of smoke that you can see on the slide here, or maybe there's so little actual smoke content that all you see is that visual distortion of the heat. That's what we're talking about when we say clean smoke. And that's what gets us that beautiful, wonderful, smoky taste in our barbecue. If that creosote gets into the food is ruined. It'll have that bitter taste, and there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. But how does that apply to cybersecurity? We need to think about metrics. And I know we talk about metrics a lot, but what are we really doing with our metrics? When I think about vulnerability management, how do I make sure that I have not just accurate metrics? Obviously, I want to know how many vulnerabilities am I discovering, how many vulnerabilities am I fixing, things of that nature. But how do I make them effective? Just knowing that we fixed 200 vulnerabilities this quarter doesn't tell me anything. Maybe okay, great, I fixed 200 of them. Did I fix 200 of them because we're fixing vulnerabilities faster? Did I fix more of them because they were all low-hanging, low-severity vulnerabilities, but we still got a bunch of high-severity vulnerabilities? Is the number of vulnerabilities I'm having to fix an indication that we have more vulnerabilities coming into our vulnerability management database because our developers are creating more code with higher levels of vulnerability? We need to understand metrics to a greater level. We need to look at our metrics and be able to draw a better picture of what do they actually mean. because the same metric, the same increase in a particular metric can be good or bad depending on its relationship to other metrics. And that's what we need to be thinking about as we start to build these out. Of course, metrics are important because this is how we demonstrate that those initiatives that we went to the board for and got them to buy in and provide us funding and resources for. This is how we show them, hey, we're actually making progress. We're doing the things that you told or that we told you we would do. It's having the expected impact. So we need to make sure that those metrics are effective so that when we look at them, we can discern them, analyze them properly, and present a more valid picture. And let's talk about how we present our metrics for a minute. We're going to set goals. We always set goals on metrics. Unfortunately, what we do a lot of times when we set metrics, because we're trying to make them measurable and attainable, stop me if you've heard that before, we set them to arbitrary numbers. So on the right here, you see attainment. Oh, we're going to fix 80% of our vulnerabilities in 6 months. Well, is that really an effective goal? Does that prove you've done anything? What if the 80% you fix are all low and medium severity, and the 20% that you didn't fix are all the critical ones that are immediately exploitable and, have patches, but you just haven't applied? You haven't measured anything positive. It's still not better. So what we really want to understand when we look at metrics is how are we improving? And we want to set our goals based on improvement, not achievement. So again, when I'm thinking of this idea of continuous improvement, that's what I need to be setting my goals for. How am I going to keep getting better today than I was yesterday? And then when I think about these goals and I think about these metrics and how I'm going to present them, I need to be aware of the audience. I will tell you right now, the very worst thing you can do is walk into an executive or board level meeting and start throwing around all the metrics numbers. Because when you come back the next time and the numbers say something different, even though they may indicate a better overall picture, those executives are going to see those individual numbers and question, why did they go down instead of up? Why did they get worse instead of better? And now you're on your back heels trying to explain, hey, this is what this all means. It's actually a good thing, when all they're seeing are graphs that are going the wrong direction. Now, conversely, when you're working in tactical teams, understanding a lot of those detailed metrics are very important. And looking at the numbers and which numbers you choose to look at are going to change based on the level of audience that you're speaking to. But what you want to do is make sure that the story that you're telling using your metrics is appropriate for that audience. When you're talking to board level, they want to understand risks. They want to understand, what does this mean for the business? How could I lower this risk in a different way? How can I address this without having to spend money? Or how much money do I have to spend, and what will it mean to me in terms of risk reduction? When I'm talking with teams, on the other hand, I'm talking very tactically, and I'm talking about how do we get these numbers to change month over month, quarter over quarter, and so forth. So being able to understand your audience and speak to the things that they think about on a daily basis is what's crucial when we start talking about metrics. Rule number 4, there is no set it and forget it. Now, I'm going to get some people are going to argue with me. I'm sure there are people out there. I'll probably get a phone call or a tweet from Dave Kennedy or someone else who I know who loves their pellet smokers. Whole point of a pellet smoker is it's supposed to be set it and forget it. So let's forget about pellet smokers for a moment. And let's talk about stick burners, or ones that burn wood. In my opinion, and this will be unpopular with some, real smokers, okay? The reality is there is no set it and forget it. I have to constantly be watching the temperature in that smoke box. Am I getting the right temperature to the meat? Am I getting the right level of smoke? I have to tend to that fire every so often. Generally, when I'm smoking meat, every hour, hour and a half, I'm going out and I'm adding wood to the fire to make sure that I can maintain a proper temperature. I might have to adjust dampers to make sure that I'm getting enough air into the fire to make it hot enough or to cool things off if it's getting too hot. Don't want to overcook my meat. I don't want to undercook my meat. I want it to get done on time. So when we think about, you guessed it, continuous improvement, how do we apply that to DevSecOps? So DevSecOps, we have this really interesting situation. We in security have known about DevOps since 2008 when the first paper was written on it. We've been trying to insert ourselves into that picture ever since, and we've been failing miserably. There's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, with DevOps and cloud native technology and CI/CD, what we have are three conflicting motions. We've got security pushing left, or trying to. We've been talking about, hey, security is going to push left. We need to push left. We need to get earlier in the cycle. We've been talking about that as long as I've been in security and even before when I was still a developer. That's like 2 decades of talking about pushing left, but we still struggle with it. Meanwhile, because of things like containers and infrastructure as code, Kubernetes, all these wonderful, cool new technologies that are being launched in cloud native environments, we have developers pushing further and further right. They're defining the very infrastructure on which their software is going to run. And then, once again, because you have that, you've now got your ops folks who are pushing up the stack. Instead of being able to focus on hardware and low-level operating system stuff, they're having to understand this infrastructure as code. They need to be, to be able to read things like YAML and to be able to look at Docker files and understand what's going on there and be able to interpret that. So we have these conflicting motions. Where security fails is that security has traditionally introduced friction. I have been to no fewer than 100 different talks on how to implement security in DevSecOps. And to a T, save for maybe 2 or 3 of them, every single one of them has talked about what we've done in security forever, and it's the thing that doesn't work in DevOps. And that is this idea of creating gates. Well, before your user story moves from the backlog to code and commit, you need to do threat modeling. And then once they commit the code, you need to do SAST and SCA and make sure you scan it. And then after we build and test it, then we need to do DAST. And at each of these gates, if it fails, we're going to kick them back to the left. That doesn't work. Those feedback cycles take a long time, and it definitely breaks the CI/CD model. It even breaks an agile DevOps model. This is what we need to get away from, and we need to think about things that I term, and you'll hear termed in the marketplace, frictionless enablement. How do I make security frictionless? And the key to that is, instead of being gates between these phases, we need to bring security as an inherent part of those phases. So threat modeling happens in the backlog. SCA and SBOM, creating an SBOM, that happens in the coding and commit cycles. SAST and DAST are part of the test process. They're not separate. We do container security. All these things need to be part of those phases. We cannot have them as pieces that are going to kick us back to the left in terms of the pipeline. Now, how do we do that? Well, we need to meet them where they live. First and foremost, as security practitioners in a DevSecOps environment, you need to be working with devs on a daily functional basis, attending stand-ups, going to their meetings, being a part of sprint planning, doing job shadowing, creating things like that. Mutual engagement by working together day to day, building empathy, because ultimately what you're trying to do is pave the road for them. To make security truly frictionless, we need to make security, the path that is secure that we want them to follow, the easiest path for them to follow. Because what we've seen in security forever is that the more obstacles we create, the more shortcuts they'll create to go around them. So we do have to focus on automation, but automation alone doesn't do it. We cannot forget about the other steps here and include the people and processes in that. But when we can create those processes, we can engage those people together, and we can provide tools that automate much of this. Now we can trust the developers to do those security steps, and they're more willing to adopt them. Finally, Pitmaster rule number 5, know your tools, your abilities, and your limitations. Check out this smoker. This is a colleague of mine who recently bought this smoker. This thing's crazy. It's 700 gallons of smoking space. Plus, you can see there's also 2 very large rotisseries. I look at that and I'm like, there is no way I could use that. One, I just don't have enough people to cook for. That's a lot of meat going on there. Now, he does things professionally. I don't. Smoker like that doesn't make a lot of sense for me. It does for him. For me, I would be lost with something like that. Just trying to manage the fire on something like that. Even as much experience as I have with smoking, it's just too much. That's too much tool for me. Why would I ever go out and buy that when instead I've got the super nice smoker that does everything I need it to do and I can manage it easily. So where this plays into security is we know security does not have unlimited budgets. And in fact, according to this survey from HelpNet Security, going into 2020, a lot of organizations were talking about things decreasing. Yeah, we see a lot that we're planning to increase as well. And that was good. It was a great picture, ultimately. The majority here were increasing. But then what happened? COVID hit. Those budgets have dried up. So it's become, once again, incumbent on us as security professionals to spend our money more wisely. Now, when we go to the marketplace tells us this. Here's everything that you need. You need a tool out of every one of these buckets, and sometimes maybe multiple tools out of every one of these buckets. No one's going to buy all this. The fact of the matter is that security industry is a $177 billion industry. I know this because I used to work for a VAR. This was our space. We sold this kind of stuff. But with all of that, just making sense of that noise and really prioritizing what you're going to use can be difficult. And as your budgets are shrinking because of things like COVID, we need to be smarter. Now, there was a really interesting study done by FireEye not that long ago, and they found out some interesting things. 60 plus tools in use on average in any enterprise environment. Of all the enterprise environments that they surveyed, they found that on average, each had at least 60 tools in use or more. Think about that for a minute. 60 different technologies that we're trying to integrate together into some cohesive strategy for securing our environment. That's crazy. That's a lot of work. 35% of those tools overlap, meaning they do the same thing. Maybe in different ways, maybe different parts of it, we use them for different reasons. And then not surprisingly, 80% of those tools are underutilized as a result. So we need to be smarter. How can we use what we already have in new ways rather than just throwing another tool at it? Let's be smarter. Let's use the tools. Let's buy the right tools, the tools that fit our environment. Don't go buy that big smoker when you can use the smaller one that's going to serve your needs for your family just fine. Do the same thing with your security tooling. So bringing this all together, to wrap this all up, planning and preparation wins the day in barbecue. You win executive sponsorship by driving business value. Can't rush your barbecue, and you cannot rush your cybersecurity either. You can't secure it all tomorrow. That's just the way it is, just like you can't cook a brisket in an hour. Good smoke is essential. Dirty smoke will ruin your barbecue. The same way that if you can't measure your program effectively, it's going to fail. There's no set it and forget it in barbecue. Even if you got one of those really cool Traeger smokers, you know what? You still have to be paying attention. You still got to be watching temperatures. And you got to do the same. You got to watch the temperature of the culture within your organization and make sure that you have accountability and enablement built into that. And then finally, know your tools and abilities and limitations, and do the same with the tools that you have in your environment. Don't go chasing the fads. Use the tools you have when you can, rather than going after something else. You follow these rules, you end up with a gorgeous brisket just like that. Check out that smoke ring. That's what we want to see. Look at the juice pouring out of that. That's a good brisket. So as I wrap up, just some things for you. All things tasty. First of all, if you want recipes, I got recipes. Lots and lots of them. I tweet out all the time different foods I'm making, including a dry rub recipe. I saw someone celebrating in Discord when I mentioned dry rub. There's a dry rub recipe out there in my GitHub. Go ahead and grab it. Also, check out Barbacan.com. Whenever the heck we get out of this COVID situation, this is going to happen. It will be a conference that will be food. We are going to barbecue. I don't know where, I don't know when, but this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to get a bunch of people together. We're going to barbecue. We'll talk some security, and we're going to eat some really amazing barbecue food. If you want to follow more of what I'm doing, check me out on Twitter, #HackerBarbecue, #HackersKitchen. You'll find everything that I've been doing, all the tasty foods I'm making. And then finally, here's where you can find me. Social media, hook up with me and let's talk. Let's talk about all the wonderful things in InfoSec. It's what I like to do. I like to share ideas. I love to hear your ideas. I love to have you challenge mine. Tell me different ways I should be thinking about things, and I like to do the same with you. Let's just continue the conversation. You see me on Twitter. That's the easiest place to find me. If you want more of a professional environment, if you're looking for help getting a job or something or whatever, you want to talk that way, find me on LinkedIn. You can also check out my website. That's where I've got all my speaking engagements. I do have a blog out there, although I will admit it is woefully inactive at the moment. We'll get that going again soon. COVID's been rough. What can I say? And with that, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for attending B-Sides Denver, for attending this talk. Thank Sneak, my employer, for making it possible for me to be here today. And of course, B-Sides Denver, I can't express enough how much I appreciate you guys having me for the second year in a row. I'm back because it's a great conference. I really loved it last year. So sad that we had to be virtual this year because I was really looking forward to seeing a lot of the people I met last year. But hey, we'll be back. And I'll be back too, hopefully. So thank you, everybody. Again, I really appreciate it.